The homeowners association gave me 7 days to tear out the ramp. I read the letter sitting on the concrete at the bottom of my own front steps. Because without that ramp, the bottom of the steps was as far into my house as I could get by myself. I read it twice. Then I looked up at my front door, at the 11-inch step between me and the inside of my life, and I laughed. It was that, or throw the letter into the street, and littering is a finable offense in Cedar Glen. My name is Marcus. I'm 44 years old, I served 2 tours in the Army, and I came home from the second one in a wheelchair. I built a ramp to my front door so I could get into the house I paid for. And the president of our little homeowners association decided that ramp was a bigger threat to the neighborhood than the step that had been keeping a grown man out of his own bathroom. He fined me $100 a day. He mailed the notices certified, so I'd have to sign for the privilege of being told I was a problem. He put a lien on my house. He was so certain that a guy in a chair wouldn't fight back that he wrote down, in his own words, exactly why he was doing it, and he signed his name to every page. That last part is going to matter more than anything else in this story. Stay with me, and I'll tell you how it ended, because the ending is the reason I'm talking at all. Let me back up to the summer we bought the place. My wife, Dana, teaches 2nd grade. I do estimating and drafting for a construction outfit, which mostly means I read blueprints and building codes for a living, from a desk, at home. Before the Army, I was a combat engineer. I know what a load is, what a slope is, what a code says, and why it says it. Keep that in your back pocket too. It matters later. The short version of the chair is this. Second tour, 2011. A road outside Kandahar that somebody had spent the night rigging. Finding the thing buried in a road like that before it found us was the whole job. And most days we did. That day we didn't. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital in Germany, with Dana's voice in the room and a doctor using the phrase incomplete spinal cord injury, which is the medical way of saying you'll get some of it back and spend the rest of your life negotiating for the rest. I got my arms all the way back. My legs and I came to an arrangement. The chair was part of the deal. Dana flew to Germany on 9 hours' notice and never once looked at me like I was less. People ask how you come back from a thing like that, and the honest answer is that mostly you come back to somebody. I came back to her. So when we finally had a little money and a little steadiness, and we found the flat ranch house in the desert with the wide halls, it wasn't just a house. It was proof we'd made it to the other side of something. That's the part Roger never understood. He thought he was fighting me over a ramp. He was standing between me and the one thing that told me the war was actually over. We bought a single-story house in a subdivision east of Phoenix called Cedar Glen. Ranch style, no interior stairs, wide enough halls, a little gravel yard that didn't need mowing. For a man in a chair, a flat house in the desert is close to perfect. We used my veterans home loan, emptied our savings into the down payment, and stood in the empty living room the first night, feeling like we'd finally landed somewhere after a lot of years of not landing anywhere. There was exactly one problem, and it was the front door. 2 concrete steps up from the walk, 11 inches of rise, and a doorway so narrow my wheels scraped paint off both sides if Dana shoved me through it hard. 30-inch door. My chair needs 32 to clear, and 36 to clear with any dignity. So on day 1, in my own new house, I could not get in the front the way every other person on the street could. I went in through the garage, up a sheet of plywood I'd bought at the hardware store, and propped on cinder blocks. And it wasn't only the front door. Inside, the doorway to the hall bathroom was 2 inches too narrow for my chair, which meant that, in the house I owned, I could not use one of my own bathrooms without a fight and a bruise. Widening an interior doorway is nobody's business but mine. So I did that one myself, quietly, that first month, with a saw, a weekend, and a hand from a buddy from my old unit. Funny thing, nobody from the association ever said a word about the door I widened inside, because they couldn't see it from the street. It was only ever about what the neighbors might see. Remember that. It's the whole case in one doorway. That plywood ramp is where this really starts. It was ugly. It flexed when Scout, our old shepherd, trotted up it ahead of me. When it rained the couple of times a year it rains out there, it turned into a slide, and I went down it once hard enough to crack a rib, and lie in the driveway for 20 minutes because Dana was at work and I couldn't get purchase on the wet wood to right myself. A neighbor's kid found me. I'll get to her. She's one of the good parts. That fall off the plywood is the whole problem in one afternoon, so let me stay in it a second. I lay on my back in my own driveway, a man who had carried other men out of worse, unable to do the one thing a toddler does without thinking, which is get up and go inside. The sky was very blue. I remember being less scared than embarrassed, and less embarrassed than furious. And not at the wood, at the arithmetic of it, at how a lip of wet plywood could undo a grown man that fast. Lily found me. She was 7, lived next door, the kind of kid who narrates everything, and she came around the hedge on her scooter, stopped, looked at me lying there, and asked, very seriously, "Are you doing that on purpose?" I said, "No, honey, go get your mom." She did, and her mother helped me up and called Dana, and Lily stood guard over me the whole time, like I might roll away. A 7-year-old took my situation more seriously than a homeowners association ever would. Hold on to that. It comes back around. So I did the sensible thing. I designed a real ramp, not a plywood board, a proper one. Pressure-treated frame, composite decking, a slope of 1 and 12 so it wouldn't throw me, a 5-foot landing at the top, handrails to code, painted the exact tan the association's own color chart calls desert sand. I drew it up myself, the way I draw up work for actual paying clients. Then I did the thing you're supposed to do. I filled out the architectural review request, attached the drawings, attached a contractor's bid, attached a letter from my doctor at the Veterans Hospital explaining, in words a child could follow, why a man with an incomplete spinal cord injury needs a ramp to enter his home. And I mailed it to the board. That was my mistake, if you want to call it one. Not building the ramp, asking first. Because asking first put my name, my chair, and my front door on the desk of a man named Roger. Roger was the president of the Cedar Glen Homeowners Association, and he had been for 9 years, which tells you most of what you need to know. Nobody ran against him. Nobody wanted the job. He'd retired early from some middle management thing and poured all of it, every ounce of a man who used to have people reporting to him, into a subdivision of 140 houses. He measured grass with a ruler. He photographed trash cans left out past noon. He was, in the fullest sense of the phrase, a man who had found his kingdom. At first, it looked like the system might actually work. A woman from the management company called and said my request had been received and would go on the agenda for the next architectural committee meeting. That meeting came and went. I called. It had been tabled. Tabled until when? Nobody would quite say. Weeks went by. This is the quiet cruelty of a board, the part the dramatic version never shows. Nobody yelled. Nobody said no. They just let a man who couldn't get into his own house wait, week after week, while the summer got hotter and the plywood got more dangerous. As if my front door were a question about mailbox paint. Then, after weeks of that, the real answer came. Certified. The first of what would become a stack. The architectural committee, which was Roger and two neighbors who did whatever Roger said, had reviewed my request and denied it. The reason given was that Cedar Glen maintains a uniform front elevation and does not permit permanent structures in the front-facing yard. If I wished, the letter said, I could construct a ramp at the rear of the property. Read that again, the way I read it at my kitchen table. A ramp at the rear of the property, behind the house, where the accessible route from the driveway is not, where my van is not, where the front door every human being uses is not. A ramp behind the house is like offering a man a glass of water and setting it on the roof. It isn't an accommodation, it's a way to say no while sounding like you tried. I want to be fair to how I felt, because I think a lot of you would have felt it. It wasn't rage exactly. Rage, I know. This was smaller and colder and worse. It was the specific humiliation of being told, politely, on association letterhead, that the uniformity of the street mattered more than whether the veteran on it could get inside when it was 108 degrees out. I sat there, and I felt like a thing on a list, a non-compliant item, a line item, review and deny. Dana came home and read it, and she did have rage. She wanted to go to Roger's house, which was 2 streets over, the big corner lot with the immaculate everything, and tell him exactly what she thought of his uniform front elevation. And here is the first place this story splits from the one you might expect. I didn't let her. Not because I'm a saint, because I'd learned something in the Army that took me a long time to learn, which is that the loudest man in the room is almost never the one who wins. The man who wins is the one who writes it all down. So we didn't go to Roger's house. We started a folder instead. Actually, we started a box. The box was a plain banker's box from the office supply store, and it lived on the kitchen counter for the better part of a year. Every certified letter went into it, in order, in its envelope, with the little green signature card stapled to the front. Every fine, every photograph, printed and dated, every email from the management company. Dana started calling it the shrine. I started calling it the case. We were both right. A folder is a feeling. A box, organized, dated, and complete, is a weapon. And the beautiful thing about it was that the other side built half of it for me and paid the postage. Here is where you need to understand Roger's real weapon, because it's the same weapon he handed me. Roger did everything certified mail. Every notice, every fine, every threat came with a little green card I had to sign and mail back so the post office could prove I'd received it. He did it to intimidate. There's something about signing for a document that makes your stomach drop, like a subpoena, like a summons. He wanted my stomach to drop. What Roger did not understand, because Roger had never in his life been on the receiving end of a system built to grind someone down, was that certified mail is a two-way street. Every green card was proof he'd sent it. Every notice was dated, itemized, and signed by him. He was building a timeline. He was building my timeline in his own hand and mailing it to me $100 at a time. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, I had to decide whether to build the ramp at all. I'll tell you what decided it. It was a Tuesday, and it was July, and the plywood had split that morning. One long crack right up the middle when I rode onto it, and I wasn't going to trust it again. So I was waiting in the driveway for Dana to get home so she could help me up the 2 steps and through the too narrow door. And I really needed the bathroom. I'm going to say that plainly, because the whole thing is built on plainness. A 43-year-old man who cleared roads under fire in Kandahar sat in his own driveway in the heat and could not get to his own toilet, and had to make a decision about his own body that no grown person should have to make in their own driveway. And I thought, very calmly, no, not one more day. Roger can deny me on paper all he wants. Roger is not the government of my front door. The next morning, I called the city and pulled a building permit. Then I called a contractor, a licensed one, and I hired him to build the ramp I'd already drawn, to code, to the exact plan I'd submitted. I painted it desert sand. When the city inspector came out, he checked the slope, checked the rails, checked the footings, signed off, and told me it was one of the cleaner residential ramps he'd seen that year. He didn't know he was signing a piece of my evidence, too. By then, I was collecting inspectors' signatures like other people collect receipts. I want you to picture the ramp, because Roger sure did. It was tan. It matched the house. It had a graceful, gentle rise, handrails a toddler could hold. And it was, by any measure a reasonable person would use, nicer than the plywood, nicer than most of the additions on the street. Lily, next door, called it the launch pad and asked if she could ride down it in her wagon. I let her, once, slow, holding the rope. Scout claimed it immediately as his personal on-ramp to the yard. For about 4 days, it was just a nice ramp on a nice street, and I could get into my house, and I cannot tell you what that did for me. I went in and out the front door 6 times that first day, for no reason at all, just to do it. Then the first fine arrived. Certified, of course. $100 for an unapproved architectural modification, plus a demand that the structure be removed within 30 days. And it was 100 more the next day, and the day after that, every day it stood. Roger had decided the ramp was a continuing violation, so the meter ran daily, which meant he could bankrupt me $100 at a time for the crime of entering my home. And $100 a day is not a number you wave off. Dana teaches 2nd grade. I do estimating from a spare bedroom. We are the exact kind of household that number is built to break. The kind that put its whole savings into a down payment and doesn't have a lawyer on retainer or a cushion for a fight. That's the quiet math of it. Roger wasn't betting I was wrong. He was betting I couldn't afford to be right. It's a good bet, usually. It's why most people just tear out the ramp. Now, this is the part where a lot of people would have panicked, and I want to tell you why I didn't, because it's the most useful thing in this whole story. I didn't panic because I finally understood what was happening. Roger wasn't enforcing a rule. If Roger were enforcing a rule, Roger would have to enforce it on everyone. And Roger, I was about to learn, enforced almost nothing on almost anyone. He'd found one item on his list he could crush, and it was me. That's when I met Carol. Carol lived across the street, a retired paralegal, widowed, drove an enormous old sedan very slowly, and had, it turned out, her own thick file on Roger going back 6 years. Because Roger had once fined her $90 over a trash can, and she was a woman who did not forget. She saw me out front photographing my own ramp for the record one evening, rolled over and said, and I'll never forget it, "Honey, are you documenting him? Because I have been documenting that man since before you moved in, and I would love some company." Carol was 71, sharp as a tack, and had spent 30 years as a paralegal at a firm downtown, which meant she thought in exhibits. She didn't get emotional about Roger. She got organized about him. The first thing she did was pour me a coffee I hadn't asked for, slide a legal pad across the table, and say, "All right, let's start at the beginning. And don't you leave anything out, dates especially." I'd known this woman 20 minutes, and she was already better at this than I was. and I read building codes for a living. Carol changed everything, and not because she was a lawyer, because she wasn't. She changed everything because she knew the shape of the thing. She sat at my kitchen table with Dana and me and a pot of coffee, and she said 2 sentences that turned the whole board over. She said, "This isn't a parking fight, sweetheart. This is a civil rights case, and they don't even know they're in one." Then she told me about the Fair Housing Act. I thought I knew my rights. Everybody says the ADA, right? Wheelchair, ramp, ADA. I said it too. And the first attorney I sat down with, a sharp woman named Angela Reyes from a fair housing center downtown, corrected me before I'd finished the sentence. And I've since learned it's the most common mistake there is. The Americans with Disabilities Act is about public places, stores, restaurants, government buildings, your workplace. It is not, mostly, about your house. Your house, and a homeowners association telling you what you can do to it, is governed by a different law, an older and in some ways stronger one, the Fair Housing Act. Angela explained it to me the way I'm going to explain it to you, because when she did, the ground stopped moving under my feet for the first time in months. Under the Fair Housing Act, she said, a housing provider, and that includes a homeowners association, has to do 2 things for a person with a disability. First, they have to allow you to make reasonable modifications to your home so you can actually use it. A ramp for a wheelchair user is the textbook example. You typically pay for it yourself, which I had, gladly. They don't have to write the check. They just aren't allowed to stand in the door. Second, they have to make reasonable accommodations in their rules. A rule that says no permanent structures in the front yard has to bend when bending it is what lets a disabled resident get inside. There was a nuance that turned out to matter, and Angela drew it on a napkin. A modification is a physical change to the property, like my ramp, and under the law, I pay for that myself, which I had. An accommodation is a change to a rule, like their no structures policy, and they have to grant that when it's reasonable and costs them next to nothing. I needed both, and they had refused both. She also told me the clock was real. You get 1 year to bring a complaint to the federal housing people and 2 years to file a lawsuit. And Roger's daily fines were, very helpfully, resetting that clock for me every single morning. They can't just say no, Angela told me. They can ask you to build it to code. They can ask you to make it match within reason. You did all of that before they even asked. What they cannot do is deny a wheelchair user a ramp to his own front door and call it a matter of standards. And they especially cannot do it while ignoring everybody else. That last word landed like a key in a lock. While ignoring everybody else. Because by then, Carol and I had spent 3 weekends and a lot of coffee doing the one thing Roger never imagined a man in a chair would do. We'd cataloged the street. So on 3 straight Saturdays, Carol and I cataloged Cedar Glen. She drove that enormous sedan at the speed of a funeral procession, while I hung out the passenger window with a camera and a clipboard, and she called out addresses and rule numbers from memory, like a woman who had been waiting years for exactly this assignment. Neighbors waved. We waved back. Nobody thought twice about the guy in the chair and the old lady creeping down the block, which was precisely the point. We were the 2 people on that street nobody took seriously, quietly building the most serious document any of them would ever be part of. Here's what selective enforcement looks like when you actually go and find it. Cedar Glen had rules against exactly the kind of thing Roger was fining me for, and Cedar Glen was full of exactly those things, none of them fined. A pergola on Sycamore, built without a permit, never cited. A satellite dish bolted to a front-facing roofline, against the rules, never cited. A second concrete driveway poured across a front yard, never cited. Storm doors in 4 different unapproved colors. A shed you could see from the street. A flagpole taller than the covenant allows. We photographed 19 separate front yard modifications on that street, dated every photo, and matched each one to the exact rule it broke. 19 violations Roger drove past every single day without so much as a note. And then there was the 20th. 2 streets over, on the corner near Roger's own house, there was a wheelchair ramp. A real one, wood, built for an elderly woman so she could get into her son's house. It had gone up 2 years before mine. It had never been submitted for architectural review. It had never been approved. And it had never, not once, been fined. It belonged to Roger's brother-in-law. I sat in my driveway and looked at the photograph of that ramp on my phone for a long time. Not angry, almost grateful. Because Roger had just told me, in poured concrete and pressure-treated lumber, that the rule wasn't a rule. The rule was a weapon, and he'd only ever pointed it at one person. I sent the photograph to Carol that night with 3 words: found the twin. She wrote back and sighed a minute, and I could hear her paralegal heart singing through the phone. She wrote, "That's not a fine anymore, honey. That's a pattern." I didn't fully understand yet what a pattern is worth in a federal complaint. I would. What I knew, sitting there in the dark with my phone glowing, was that Roger had built his own trap 2 years before I ever moved in, and that the best part of this whole story was still a year away, at a meeting I didn't yet know I would be sitting in. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. First, I had to hit the bottom. That was the bottom, though, in a way. And I want to be honest about the bottom, because the shape of these stories always skips it, and it shouldn't. The bottom wasn't the discovery. The bottom was the lien. In the fall, Roger's board recorded a lien against my house for the accumulated fines. By then, over $9,000 and climbing 100 a day. A lien is a real thing. It clouds your title. In the wrong circumstances, an association can move to foreclose on it. Dana read the lien notice at the kitchen table and put her face in her hands. And Dana is not a woman who does that. We had put everything into that house, and a man 2 streets over was telling us, on paper, that he could take it, over a ramp, while his own brother-in-law's ramp sat in the sun untouched. That night I sat out on the ramp, the good one, the tan one, after Dana had gone to bed. Scout came and put his head on my knee. It was cool for once, and the launch pad Lily loved was just a dark shape sloping down to the driveway. And I did the math a person does at the bottom. What it would cost. What it would cost to lose. Whether a guy in a chair really can beat a man who's run this place for 9 years and has 2 streets of neighbors trained to look away? I'm not going to pretend I was certain. I wasn't. But I thought about the driveway in July, and I thought, one more time, no. Not the toilet, not the lien, not one more day of Roger deciding where the edge of my life is. I went inside, easily, through my own front door, and I opened the box of green cards and I started numbering them. Let me pause here for just a second. If you've made it this far with me, you already know the feeling I'm about to describe. The one where a form and a signature stand between you and something that should simply be yours. Stay with me, because this is where it turns, and the turn is the whole reason I tell it. The next morning I signed with Angela, and we filed a complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD. And I want to slow down here, because this is the part the loud version of this story never shows you. And it's the part that actually works. We did not go on the internet and yell. We did not put a sign in the yard. We did not knock on Roger's door. What we did was assemble, in one binder, the quietest and most devastating thing you can hand a federal investigator. The denied request with my doctor's letter attached. The city permit and the inspector's sign-off proving the ramp was legal and safe. The 41 certified letters, in order, each one over Roger's signature. The lien. And 19 dated photographs of unenforced violations, plus the 20th, the brother-in-law's ramp, circled in red. Selective enforcement isn't an accusation when you lay it out like that. It's just arithmetic. Everyone who broke the rule and wasn't fined, next to the one man who followed the rule, built to code, and was fined into a lien. The difference between them, the only difference, was the chair. Angela filed under 3 theories, and she named them so plainly that even I understood them. Failure to permit a reasonable modification, failure to make a reasonable accommodation, and retaliation, because the fines only started raining after I asserted my rights. She told me the association had a window to make this go away cheaply and quietly, and that in her experience, men like Roger never take it, because men like Roger cannot conceive of losing to a person they've already filed under review and deny. A few weeks later, a HUD investigator came out to the house. I'd braced for a bureaucrat with a clipboard. What I got was a calm woman with a measuring tape who checked the slope of my ramp herself, photographed the handrails, and asked me to walk her through everything in order, while she wrote almost none of it down and, I'm certain, remembered all of it. Then she asked the question that decides these cases. She asked whether other homes in Cedar Glen had unapproved modifications that had never been cited. I handed her the binder. She turned straight to the page with the brother-in-law's ramp, looked at it a long moment, and said, quietly, "Well, that's helpful." Investigators don't say that unless it's very helpful. She was right. Roger doubled down, and this is where the dramatic irony gets almost unbearable. Because for a few months, Roger thought he was winning. He told a neighbor, who told Carol, that the whole thing was a nuisance and that his lawyer said the association would be fine. He kept the fines running. At the fall association meeting, he stood up and described, without naming me, an ongoing enforcement action against a resident who thought the rules didn't apply to him. And some people nodded, because that's how it works. You nod at the shape of a story before you know the facts. He was so sure. He had no idea that 3 streets of his own certified letters were sitting numbered in a box in my garage, and that a federal investigator had already requested the association's records. Because here's what a HUD complaint does that a yelling match never will. It has teeth, and it has subpoenas. The investigator didn't take my word for anything. She requested the association's emails, its meeting minutes, its enforcement logs, its files. And that, right there, is the moment the ground opened under Roger, though it took a while for him to fall in. Because Roger, like a lot of men who've never been checked, wrote things down. He wrote emails. He wrote a lot of them. I told you at the very beginning that Roger put in writing exactly why he was doing it. Here's what the association's own files turned up, the ones the investigator had the power to demand. And I'll never forget reading them in Angela's office. There was an email from Roger to the 2 committee members about my request before they denied it, that said the ramp would set a precedent, and that, quote, "We can't have handicap ramps up and down the front of Cedar Boulevard. It kills the comps, and it's not the image we sell." There was another, after I built it anyway, where he told them the goal was to make it, quote, "expensive enough that he tears it out himself and we never have to approve one." And there was a short one, the one that ended it, where a committee member actually asked Roger about the brother-in-law's ramp, about whether they were exposed for never citing it. And Roger wrote back one line. He wrote, "That's different. That's family. Just don't put it in the minutes." Just don't put it in the minutes. He put it in an email. To ask them not to write it down, he wrote it down. One of those committee members was a guy named Kevin, younger, newer, who I think had been going along to get along, the way people do, until he saw where the along went. When the investigator came for records, Kevin didn't scrub anything. He handed over everything. And later he sat for a statement and said plainly that he'd been uncomfortable for months, that Roger ran the board like a private grudge, and that the brother-in-law's ramp had bothered him since the day the fines against me started. I've never been close with Kevin. I don't need to be. He did the one thing the story needed a witness to do, which was tell the truth on the record, when telling it cost him the easy road with Roger. HUD found reasonable cause. I'll say that again, because those two words are the whole ballgame. A federal agency looked at the ramp, the letters, the photographs, and Roger's own emails, and formally concluded there was reasonable cause to believe the Cedar Glen Homeowners Association had discriminated against me because of my disability. Once that finding lands, the association's own lawyer stops arguing with you and starts arguing with the association. Because now it isn't a nuisance resident. Now it's a civil rights finding, a federal case, damages, the association's attorney's fees, and mine, and, if it went all the way, civil penalties on top. Their insurance carrier did the math Roger never bothered to do, and the math said, settle. Angela told me something in that stretch I've never let go of. She said the law doesn't win these on outrage, it wins them on records. Because a judge can't feel your July driveway. But a judge can read a denied request, a permit, an inspection, 41 fines, 19 ignored violations, and an email that says, "Just don't put it in the minutes." You didn't beat them by being sympathetic, she said. You beat them by being right, on paper, in a way nobody could argue with. Then she said the sentence I've been waiting a year to hear. She said, "They want to settle." We settled by consent decree, which is a fancy way of saying the court signed off on the terms so they'd have real weight. And the terms were simple, and I read them out loud to Dana at the kitchen table, where she'd once put her face in her hands. And this time, neither of us covered our faces. Every fine, voided. The lien, released. The ramp, permitted permanently. In writing, forever. The association had to pay me $40,000 in damages, and it had to pay Angela's fees, which by the end were more than the damages. And I did not feel bad about a single dollar of it.
And the part that mattered more than the money, the part I actually fought for? Cedar Glen had to adopt a real written reasonable accommodation and reasonable modification policy, with a deadline to answer requests. And the whole board had to sit through fair housing training, so that the next person in a chair, or the next mom with a kid who needs a ramp, or the next old man who can't do stairs anymore, would never have to spend a July in their own driveway deciding what I had to decide. Roger did not sign the training sheet with a smile, but he signed it. The man who mailed me 41 letters, certified, had to sign for a few himself. You'd think that's the end, the satisfying part. The folder wins. And it is satisfying, coldly, completely, the way the good ones are. But it isn't the best part. And I promised you the best part at the start. The best part came at the annual meeting, and it had nothing to do with me.
and everything to do with the neighbors who'd nodded along.
Because here's what settlements do that the nodders can't ignore. They show up in the budget. Insurance covered some of it, but the deductible, the fees that ran past the policy, and a premium that jumped the way premiums always do after a claim, came straight out of the reserve fund, and then out of everybody's dues. Which meant every single household in Cedar Glen opened a notice that fall about a special assessment and a dues increase, and for the first time, they went looking for why. And what they found, because Carol made very sure it was findable, was that their money, their reserve, their dues, had been spent fighting a disabled veteran over a ramp that matched the house, while the president's own brother-in-law had an identical ramp 2 streets over that never cost a dime. They found out they'd paid, personally, out of pocket, for Roger's private grudge. The room did not go silent, the way it does in the dramatic version. It did the opposite. At the annual meeting in October, a subdivision full of people who had spent 9 years not wanting the job suddenly wanted it very much. Carol ran for the board. So did Kevin. So did 3 neighbors I'd never met, one of whom, it turned out, had a son with muscular dystrophy and had been quietly dreading the day she'd have to ask Roger for anything. I went to that meeting. I sat in the back by the door, where I sit now because I can. And I listened to neighbors I had never once spoken to stand up, one after another. A man said he'd assumed I was some troublemaker until he saw the photos of all the other ramps and sheds. A woman said out loud that she was ashamed she'd nodded along the year before. The mother of the boy who uses a chair didn't make a speech. She looked at Roger and said, "You made me afraid to ask you for a ramp for my son." And then she sat down, and the room went quiet in a way none of Roger's meetings ever had. They voted. It wasn't close. Roger lost the presidency he'd held for 9 years by a margin that told you everyone had known all along exactly what kind of man he was, and had only been waiting for a reason and a ballot. Carol is the president of the Cedar Glen Homeowners Association now. Her first act was to formally thank the brother-in-law for his lovely, long-standing, fully grandfathered wheelchair ramp. She has a sense of humor, Carol. They asked me to join the architectural committee. Me, the non-compliant item. Review and deny. I said yes on one condition, which is that we change the form, and we did. The Cedar Glen architectural request now has a line at the top in bold that says, "If this request relates to a disability or medical need, check here, and we will respond within 14 days and work with you." I drew the ramp on the corner of that form myself. Little tan ramp, 1 in 12. Some of the neighbors think it's a decoration. It's a promise. Here's what happened next, because I know that's the part you actually stayed for. It's been a little over a year since the judge signed the decree. That new policy has already been used twice. An older couple on Sycamore, the husband's on oxygen now, asked for a ramp and grab bars, and the committee approved it in 9 days. And I went over and helped him figure out his slope. He went down that brand new ramp the day it passed inspection, rolled straight out to his mailbox and back, for no reason at all. The exact way I had that first morning. And then he sat at the top of it and got quiet for a while. I pretended to check the handrail bolts and gave him the minute. Some things a man should get to have in private, on his own ramp, at the top of his own front steps. A young mom 2 streets over got a variance for a fenced, shaded spot in her side yard for her son, who has seizures and needs somewhere safe and soft to be outside.
9 days and a variance, instead of a lien and 11 months and a federal case. That is the entire difference. That's what the box of green cards bought. Roger sold his house that spring and moved to a subdivision on the other side of town, one with even stricter rules than ours, which I think about sometimes and enjoy more than I should. The box of certified letters is still in my garage, numbered, the most expensive stack of paper Roger ever signed. Lily's crayon drawing of me and Scout on the launch pad is framed by the front door, because a 7-year-old was the first person on that street to look at my ramp and see the good thing it obviously was. Scout still noses the door open every morning and trots down the ramp ahead of me to bark at nothing. And I still do estimating and drafting from my desk, except now, once or twice a month, I do something else too. Angela sends me people. Vets mostly, and some who aren't. People in chairs staring at a denial letter from a board, sure they've lost before they've started. I tell them what Carol told me. This isn't a parking fight, it's a civil rights case. And they don't even know they're in one. Then I help them build the box. These days I cross my own threshold a dozen times a day and never once think about it. That's the whole point, and it's taken me this long to understand it. Getting into your own home is supposed to be the least remarkable thing you do all day. It's supposed to be nothing. It took a federal complaint, a consent decree, and one man too proud to stop writing things down to make it nothing again. And I would do every bit of it over, the July driveway included, because the ramp was never really about me. It's about the old man on oxygen who got his in 9 days. Worth every certified letter. Let me leave you with the thing I keep chewing on, and I genuinely like to hear where you land, because I go back and forth. Was I right to stay quiet and build the box? To let the paper trail and the law do the work? Or should I have driven to Roger's house that first day, the day Dana wanted to, and looked him in the eye before any of it started? I chose the folder over the fight. Most days, I'm sure that's why I won. Some days, I'm not so sure it should have to take a federal case to get a man into his own bathroom. If this one got to you, do me a favor and hit like and subscribe if you want to stick around, because I read every single one of these true stories myself, and there's always another one coming. Tell me honestly in the comments, folder or front door? Would you have documented it cold or confronted him hot? And I'm always curious who's out there in the dark with me, so drop your state and your age when you comment. I want to know where you're all listening from. I'll see you in the next one.